All right, folks, so welcome along. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is John Reece. I am Professor of Psychology here at ACAP. I'm physically located in the Melbourne campus of ACAP, but like everybody, I'm now working from home using Zoom extensively. So let me tell you a little bit about what this session this afternoon is all about. So this is what's called an experience session, in the sense that I'm going to talk to you today about a topic that is not, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to give an information session about studying at ACAP and doing courses at ACAP. We had one of those a couple of weeks ago. This is instead something we call an experience session, which is an opportunity for me to talk to you a little bit about a topic that is of great interest to psychology and other areas. And it's designed to give you a bit of a feel, a bit of a taster for the sorts of things that you study when you study psychology and related sort of disciplines. So that's what this session's all about. Now, what I'd encourage you to do is to use the chat box if you want to ask questions about the presentation today, or if you want to ask questions about studying at ACAP. We've got some course advisors online, and those course advisors will be monitoring the chat very, very closely. So anything that you would like to ask about studying at ACAP, about any of our courses, please do go ahead and ask that. If you've got any questions about what I'm presenting today, again, use the chat box. And what I'll do is at the end of the presentation, I'll quickly go through the chat box. I'll select a few questions and I'll answer a few questions. Because of the nature of the forum, we don't really have time to have questions during the presentation. So please use the chat box and save up your questions throughout the presentation, and I'm very happy to go through a few of those. Depending on our time, we do need to wrap it up by 3. So that's 3 Melbourne time, 3 Eastern Australian time, wherever you may be logging in from. So yeah, you do use that chat box to communicate. So what I'm going to do now is just share the screen and get the presentation up and running, so we can have a bit of a talk about it. So what I'm going to be talking with you about today is the very important and very controversial topic around sanity and insanity within the context of a particularly important case study, particularly important historical case study, something that certainly everybody who is a Melbourne resident will have very vivid memories of, and people in other states may also remember this as well. It was a very, very dramatic event that occurred in Australia, but particularly for Melbourne. Okay, so cast your minds back, 20th of January 2017, just over 3 years ago. A fellow by the name of James, or Jimmy Gargasoulas, drove his car as a weapon at 60 kilometres an hour down the Bourke Street Mall, which is a major shopping pedestrian mall right in the central of Melbourne. 6 people were killed in this horrible incident, including 2 children, 1 a baby. 36 people were injured. It was certainly one of the most traumatic events in the city's history. Now, this event raises a lot of questions, and raised and continues to raise a lot of very important questions around law, but there are also some questions related to this case that psychology can have some input into. So the first question I want to pose here is, what can psychology tell us about the Gargasoulas case, the case of Jimmy Gargasoulas? And here are some of the key questions that psychology, the discipline of psychology, can have some input into. What do we mean by these terms sanity and insanity in the context of a legal situation such as this? How is sanity seen by the law? Around the Gargasoulas case, there was a lot of discussion around mental illness, the role that mental illness played in Gargasoulas's behaviour, the role of mental illness in his capacity to receive a trial, to his capacity to be part of the legal system. But what do we mean when we use a phrase such as mental illness? Gargasoulas was found by the courts to be fit to stand trial. Why was that the case? In the Gargasoulas case, there was also a lot of discussion around the role of drugs and the interaction between drugs and mental health. So what is that relationship? We'll talk a little bit about that. And there was also discussion about dangerousness and mental illness. And let's ask the question, are people with mental illness dangerous? So these are some of the big questions that arose as a result of the GARGASOULAS case. And these are some questions that the discipline of psychology can most definitely have some input into and can inform some of these really important questions. So let's begin with this term, this concept of sanity, and mental illness. First of all, really important point I want to make to you. The terms sane and insane are much more legal terms. They're not terms that are used in clinical practice. They're not terms that are used in psychology. They're used in legal contexts. In psychology, we're much more likely to use terms such as mental illness or mental health issue, which raises the question, what do we mean by a mental illness? What is a mental illness? Now, these links are all active, and I'm just going to show you some of these links throughout. This is a really good website from the Commonwealth Department of Health, and it opens up with that key question, what is mental illness? A mental illness is a health problem that significantly affects how a person feels, thinks, behaves, and interacts with other people. It's diagnosed according to standardized criteria. The term mental disorder is used to refer to these health problems. So this is what we talk about when we use the term mental illness in this context. How do we classify mental illnesses? What are the sorts of terminologies that we use? What are the sorts of systems that we have for classifying different types of mental health conditions? There's many, but the one that is used most commonly in psychology is something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is known more commonly as the DSM. And the DSM is now up to its 5th edition. It does get fairly constantly upgraded, but here's a website that shows you the DSM. It's a production of the American Psychiatric Association, and it provides a very comprehensive discussion, very comprehensive diagnostic set of criteria for a whole range of mental health disorders. There are many, many different types of mental illness, many types, but in very crude and broad terms, we can think of 3 very major categories. The first is the psychotic conditions, most commonly represented by schizophrenia. By the way, schizophrenia is not split personality. That's a very common misunderstanding. There is a condition known as dissociative personality disorder that is, to use a crude term, split personality, but that is not schizophrenia at all. They are not the same thing. Bipolar disorder, such as manic, which is more commonly known as manic depression. The second major category is what we refer to as mood disorders, and the most common here are depression and anxiety. And the third major grouping are what we call personality disorders. And with personality disorders, we have a type of personality disorder, we recognize one called antisocial personality disorder, who are more commonly referred to generically as people who are psychopaths or sociopaths. Those terms aren't actually used in the DSM. They're not diagnostic criteria. They're more common usage terms, everyday usage terms. The more formal title for that sort of condition is what we refer to as an antisocial personality disorder. Now, what is the relationship between mental health and the law? First of all, it is a very complex relationship. And the relationship between mental illness and mental health and the law is governed by a range of laws, state and federal. So if you're living in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, WA, South Australia, whatever, there are going to be laws within those states that play a really important role around the relationship between mental illness and law. And there are also federal laws as well. This is a very topical area. It's a very fluid area. It evolves a lot. It is an area of great controversy. It's an area of great social and health-related importance because it includes things such as compulsory treatment, being treated against your will, involuntary detention, restraint, being secluded, being incarcerated. And these are, of course, incredibly important issues for people's individual rights. And so these laws are very complex laws, they're very detailed laws, they're controversial laws, and they're evolving laws. So there are very complex laws and processes that govern the treatment of people with mental illness. Here's a link to a very important body in Victoria. There are similar bodies in other states. This is the Mental Health Tribunal. The Mental Health Tribunal is a body that is fundamentally set up to help deal with the rights of people with mental illness, people who, for example, are receiving compulsory treatment, either in an institution or in the community, have the opportunity to have their cases considered by the Mental Health Tribunal on a regular basis. So you might want to take a look at that website to get an idea about what the Mental Health Tribunal does and the background to it, and so on. It's really important stuff in the area of mental health services in this state. And there are, as I said, there are similar bodies all throughout Australia. So what were the legal issues in the GARGASOULAS case that most directly relate to psychology? Look, the first question is the main one. This was the one that was so central. Was GARGASOULAS sane? Was he fit to stand trial? This was the central question that was addressed in this particular case. And here's a nice link that talks about the whole issue in Australia. This is a paper that was brought out by the Australian Psychological Society that talks about mental impairment and fitness to stand trial, the issues around mental impairment and being found to be fit to stand trial, and how that's assessed and how that's evaluated. So you can take a look at that one. The key concept that underlies this whole notion is the concept of competency. And the question that's asked with competency is quite a straightforward one. Is a person able to understand the charges against them? And are they able to assist in their own defence? That is the central question that gets addressed when competency to stand trial is considered. And this doesn't just relate to people with a mental illness, but the three major categories of persons for whom this is an issue are those people who are experiencing a mental illness, particularly a psychotic mental illness, because it's psychosis that represents the most dramatic break from reality and has the most dramatic impact on a person's capacity to understand charges and be able to assist in their own defence. But it also relates to a person who may have been charged who has an intellectual disability. It might be a person who suffers from a medical condition, particularly a neurological medical condition that has cognitive consequences and results in the person not being able to understand the charges against them, not being able to assist in their own defence. So this is the key principle, the principle of competency. Now, having any of those conditions does not automatically mean that you're not competent to stand trial. You may have a psychotic mental illness, you may have an intellectual disability, you may have a medical condition, but that in and of itself does not mean that you are not competent to stand trial. The judgment goes beyond the diagnostic condition. This has a long history, and that history relates to the notion of criminal responsibility. And this is a very common legal idea that goes all around the world in many, many legal jurisdictions. And the general principle here is that only blameworthy persons, those with a mens rea, a criminal mind, should be punished. So this is why children, people with an intellectual disability, people with a neurological impairment, and people who are, in quotes, insane are not considered to be fit to stand trial because they are not considered to be blameworthy. They cannot have a criminal mind. This is the legal principle. This goes all the way back to 16th century England, where it's stated that an act cannot be considered a felony if the offender has no conception of good and evil. In the 18th century, we read quotes such as the defendant, quote, doth not know what he is doing no more than a wild beast, unquote. A really important principle in this area was something called the M'Naghten Standard, which was stated in 1843. And the M'Naghten Standard arose as a result of an attempted assassination of the then British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli. And the person who perpetrated the crime was found to be unfit to stand trial. And the M'Naghten Standard states that an accused cannot be held accountable for a crime if, quote, at the time of the committing of the act, the party accused was labouring under such a defect of reason from disease of the mind as to not know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know what he was doing was wrong. And that standard, which was first propagated in 1843 has been refined, but it is still very, very influential in Australian law and in British law and in US law as an important standard that dictates capacity to stand trial. So what's the role of the psychologist in this sort of enterprise? What role does a psychologist play? Well, psychologists will often play the role of expert witnesses in this area, and their main role is to assess the accused person and to provide a report to the court as to whether the person is fit to stand trial. Now, they can represent the Crown or they can represent the defence. I mean, and you can have psychologists with competing views. You can have a psychologist who's an expert witness presenting information on behalf of the Crown or the prosecutor, and you can have a psychologist, presenting evidence on behalf of the person who's accused, the defence, and that's quite common. So how is this done? Every discipline that you study has its areas of expertise, the things that it really is good at. And so in psychology, I think the thing that psychologists would really pride themselves on as being an area of particular skill and expertise as a result of extensive training is diagnosis and assessment. So assessment, evaluation, diagnosis, that's an area where psychologists receive extensive training and would argue are very skilled in that area. And assessment is a very multifaceted process. There's a mistaken belief that when psychologists conduct evaluations and assessments that they use nothing but paper and pencil tests, and that's completely and totally untrue. Yes, psychometric tests, standardized tests and instruments are a very important component of evaluation and assessment, but they're not the only component of evaluation and assessment. Skilled interviewing is an important part of it. The examination of documents and other materials related to the case outside of tests and instruments are an important part of it. And this also includes interviewing other people, such as those who know the accused well, who have worked with the accused family, friends, partners, workmates, things along those lines. That's an important part of it. So proper assessment and evaluation is a very multifaceted process that uses a range of sources of information to come up with an informed decision, an informed judgment about the person's psychological state. It's an important exercise because what the psychologist says can have a very profound impact on a person's well-being and on their liberty and on how they're seen by the court. So it's something that's taken very, very seriously by the discipline, by the profession. So what happened in the GARGASOULAS case? It was a very ongoing exercise. It was an exercise where there was a lot of debate and discussion. There was disagreeing views. But at the end of the day, GARGASOULAS was found fit to stand trial. And even though it was clear that GARGASOULAS was mentally ill, a jury found that he met the competency test. He demonstrated criminal responsibility. Remember I said that having a mental illness, having an intellectual disability, having a neurological disorder is not in and of itself a reason not to be found fit to stand trial. It is the competency test that's the important criterion that's used. And even though GARGASOULAS himself was mentally ill, and I think there was very little doubt about that, the jury found that he met the competency test, that he demonstrated criminal responsibility. Now, I'm not saying this was not a controversial decision. It was. There were many professionals who disagreed with the jury's decision. But the jury's decision is the jury's decision, and GARGASOULAS was found fit to stand trial. There was, both in the popular media and in the professional area, there was a lot of discussion about this decision by the jury in this particular case. So it wasn't a straightforward one. It was one of the more controversial, topical areas of discussion around this, but at the end of the day, that's the jury's decision. There's a couple of links to various sites that were talked about this from The Age. Burke Street accused James GARGASOULAS fit to stand trial for murder in the ABC. And you can see that it was a really, really big deal at the time. James GARGASOULAS is fit to stand trial for Burke Street killings, Melbourne jury finds, and in news.com. So probably the three major news networks within Victoria, all giving effectively front page coverage to this very important very important matter. Okay, so a few things I think we can learn from this, a few things I think we can sort of consider when we talk about it. And this is where psychology can play a really important role in informing our understanding around issues related to the GARGASOULAS case. I think the first point that I want to make is that people who are mentally ill, even seriously mentally ill, are not mentally ill all the time. So symptoms can vary enormously. A person can be mentally ill in the period before a crime is committed, but not ill at the time that the crime is committed. Okay, that's important. A person may not be ill or have very low level symptoms before a crime is committed, but in the action of committing the crime, they were in fact very seriously disabled, very seriously mentally ill. A person can develop a mental illness after committing a crime. So they may not be ill at the time of the crime is committed, but they develop the illness after the crime was committed. So there's a lot of variation in mental health symptoms. When we stick a label on somebody, which is a very, very serious and can be a very dangerous exercise, such as this person has schizophrenia or this person has depression, those labels carry stereotypes. The stereotype might be that if, for example, you've received a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, that you are always disabled, that you are always mentally ill, that you're always hearing voices, experiencing delusions, having hallucinations, having serious thought disorder. That's not the case. Yes, there are some people who, it's like any sort of illness. Look at COVID-19, something that we're all, very, very familiar with. Some people are infected with COVID-19 and have absolutely no symptoms whatsoever. And we know that sadly, COVID-19 can be a fatal illness for some people. Well, I'm not comparing mental illness with COVID-19 because they're completely different, of course, but I'm just drawing the analogy in the range of symptoms that can occur. A person can have a diagnosis of a mental health condition such as depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or something like that, and their symptoms may be very short-lived. They may be relatively minor compared with other people. They may recover completely and never have another problem for the rest of their lives, all the way through to people who are profoundly disabled by the severity of their mental health condition. So symptoms do vary enormously. I think that's a really important point to be aware. As I said, so a person can be seriously mentally ill at the time of committing an offence, but not afterwards. A person may develop a mental illness after committing a crime. Now, when we talk about the sorts of things that were discussed in the GARGASOULAS case, even though there are many, many, many different types of mental health conditions, there are only certain types that really do come into play, primarily the psychotic disorders. And these are the disorders that have what we call active symptoms, such as hallucinations. Hallucinations are primarily auditory, much more rarely are they visual. The hallucinations can also take the form of delusions, particularly paranoid delusions. A person may hear voices that are instructing them. They may experience highly disordered thinking, and so on. These are primarily the majority of the cases that get considered in the context of fitness to stand trial. And it's these sorts of mental health conditions, these sorts of symptoms that we think about when we use the generic terms insane within this context. As I said, the terms sanity and insanity are not really clinical terms, they're more legal terms within this particular context. So it's these sorts of highly florid, active psychosis type symptoms that most come into play when we're talking about the types of things surrounding the GARGASOULAS case. And certainly around the GARGASOULAS case, they were the types of symptoms, the types of cognitions and behaviours and disorders that were discussed within that context. Mood disorders are far, far less considered and far less relevant in the context of these sorts of cases. It does happen, but it's far less the case. And of course, people don't just suffer from one, or people, sorry, let me rewind. It's not the case that a person only ever suffers from one mental health condition. There are situations where a person can experience a range of mental health conditions. A person experiencing a psychotic disorder may also have serious depression as well. So that's not uncommon. What we call personality disorders, they're actually, from a legal point of view, not considered a mental illness for the purpose of assessing fitness to stand trial. And you might find that really surprising. But the people who we label with terms such as psychopath and sociopath, um, from a strict diagnostic point of view, are not considered to have a mental illness for the purpose of assessing fitness to stand trial, because it's not what we think of in the classic sense as being sane or insane. And that's a very, very topical area, the relationship between antisocial personality disorder and fitness to stand trial. There's been some very important cases around that area, and that's a whole nother topic that we don't have time to go into today. Now, another issue that was discussed a lot within the GARGASOULAS case was the role of drug use, particularly the role of drug use for people who have a mental illness. The facts are these: drugs interact very badly with mental illness. The interaction between having a mental illness and taking certain types of drugs, it's not a good one. It's not a great mix. It really does exacerbate mental health symptoms, and can cause symptoms for people who don't have a mental illness. Although some people do use drugs and alcohol to what we call self-medicate. And the concept of self-medication is a very important one in the treatment of people with mental illness and the care and treatment of people with mental illness, because the use of drugs and alcohol can make people feel better. That's what's called self-medication, even if that change is temporary. Now, it's not a particularly productive and healthy way to look after yourself, but it's something that people do, and it needs to be taken into consideration. There are some drugs, such as ice and speed, amphetamine and methamphetamine, that can actually cause psychosis, even in people that have no previous symptoms. The concept or the condition of amphetamine-induced psychosis has been known for a very, very long period of time, and we've seen that with methamphetamine, with ice, actually leading to psychosis-like symptoms and psychosis-like behaviours. There are people who are prone to developing a mental illness, who have what we call a prodromal condition, who may be traveling on okay, but they're prone to developing a mental illness for a whole range of factors and influences, who can be tipped over by drug use, such as a drug-induced psychosis. Drugs and alcohol have what we call an interactive relationship with mental illness. In other words, that they don't sort of operate independently of the mental illness. They will actually work with the mental illness and interact with the mental health condition. And that's not a great mix. GARGASOULAS was a very heavy drug user, and there was a lot of discussion about this in his trial, particularly the component of his trial about whether he was fit to stand trial. And there's no doubt that this drug use exacerbated his symptoms. But remember, when we talk about drugs, always remember, always be very, very aware that some of the most dangerous drugs, alcohol and tobacco, are 100% legal. And we know the influence of heavy alcohol use. Heavy alcohol use in general is a very destructive, very personally and socially destructive exercise. And we always need to, when we talk about drugs, that we're not just talking about illegal drugs. It includes prescription drugs and perfectly legal drugs as well. One of the big areas of discussion around the GARGASOULAS case, and it happens every time a person exhibiting mental illness or mental health symptoms commits a high-profile crime, is the question of, are people with mental illness dangerous? And it's a question that's worth asking. We can't bury our heads in the sand and pretend that that question shouldn't be asked. It's a question that's going to be asked whether we like it or not. Now, given what you would read in the media and see on the television and look at on the internet, you would think that the answer is yes, that when a person with a serious mental health condition or mental illness commits a high-profile crime, it is splashed all over the place. It's a really, really big deal. And so, because that information is so readily accessible to everybody, you would think that the answer is yes, that people with a mental illness are more dangerous than people without a mental illness. But the data tells a different story. And this is, again, where psychology and psychological research can help inform a really important question of this nature. All the research shows that people with a mental illness are no more dangerous or violent than the general population. What's important here is not the illness, it's the person. So a person who is violent and dangerous without a mental illness is going to be violent and dangerous with a mental illness. So what's crucial is not the illness, it's the person. The fact is that people with mental illness are actually most dangerous to themselves. And the suicide rate for people and the self-harm and suicide rate for people with mental illness is very high. So, as I said, these are the facts. All the research shows that people with a mental illness are no more dangerous or violent towards others than people in the general population. I think part of the issue here is that there's no doubt that some symptoms of serious mental illness can be quite confronting. They can be quite scary. If you are in a city street, all you've got to do is walk around a big city such as Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or Adelaide or Perth or Hobart or wherever, and you will see people with serious mental illness. We know that the issue of homelessness for people with serious mental illness is a major issue. And those people can engage in behaviours that are quite confronting, quite scary, and can be perceived as quite hostile. And on some occasions they are. But on the majority of occasions, they're not. But these people can be talking to themselves, they can be swearing in a very loud voice, they can say very strange things to you, act towards you in a very strange and unusual way, sometimes in a way that you perceive as being hostile or aggressive. And that can be quite confronting and quite scary, but it's not necessarily dangerous. You know, the fact that a person acts in a way that is unconventional, confronting, loud, inappropriate, socially inappropriate, doesn't necessarily mean that they're dangerous. So I think we need to be quite aware of that. But why do we sometimes think that people with mental illness are dangerous? Why is there a perception maybe that people with mental illness are dangerous? Well, again, psychology can shed some light on this. Two very prominent researchers in psychology, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, have done a lot of work, or did a lot of work, Tversky sadly passed away, have done a lot of work on the area of judgment and decision making, how we make judgments about what's going on in the world. You learn this when you study cognitive psychology. Tversky and Kahneman actually won the Nobel Prize for economics for their work on the psychology of economic decision making from individuals and societies. And in that work, they described a whole lot of processes that we engage in naturally as human beings that impact our judgments that we make of events that are going on in the world. They're called heuristics. They're mental shortcuts that we engage in to help us make sense of the massive information that we need to deal with as human beings. And one of those is called the availability heuristic. And what the availability heuristic refers to is that when we make a judgment about the prevalence of something, our judgment is biased by how easily we can recall notable examples. So if you're making a judgment about the likelihood of something occurring or the prevalence of an event or something along those lines, then your judgment tends to be biased by just how easily you can think of very notable examples of that event. Here's three examples. What's happened to the murder rate in Victoria over the last 100 years? Now, you might read a story about a horrible murder, and I'm not in any way downgrading the impact of murder. It's a terrible, terrible crime. But you might read about a story or see a story about that on the paper or on the TV or on the internet. There might be a flood of stories related to murder, and you might think to yourself, oh, society's it's going down the tubes. Murders are happening on a daily basis. It's a very dangerous place to be, blah, blah, blah. In fact, when you look at the statistics, when you look at the cold, hard, somewhat boring numbers, in fact, the murder rate in Victoria has changed very, very little over the last 100 years and may have in fact dropped because some of the deaths that occurred, particularly the deaths of women and children, female partners and children in the earlier part of the century may not have actually been classified as murder. Even though they were. So in fact, the data tells a completely different story, that the murder rate in Victoria has either stayed very stable or in fact may actually have dropped. What animal kills more people than any other? You might think, for example, it's sharks, or it could be tigers or something like that. People think about when you read a case about a shark killing somebody, it's a terrible thing, of course. But if you're asking the question, what animal kills more people than any other, it's in fact the mosquito. So the mosquito is an animal, and the mosquito is responsible for more deaths worldwide than any other animal. If you think about a big animal, certainly in some parts of the world, it's the water buffalo or the hippopotamus. And yet we don't think of them as being particularly lethal types of animals. We might think of tigers or lions or wild dogs or crocodiles or something like that. But in fact, it's other animals. That's what the data tells us. Is Victoria in the middle of a crime wave? Again, if you look at some popular press, you would think, yeah, we're in the middle of a terrible crime wave. You can't step outside without being attacked. There was a lot of discussion around African gangs in Melbourne just last year, that people were scared to go out to restaurants and eat because there was this crime wave being perpetrated by African gangs. In fact, when you looked at the stats, the crime stats, in fact, the crime levels, even though certain crimes do go up and down, as they always will, that the overall crime rate was quite steady. In fact, it was dropping in Victoria. So these are examples of the availability heuristic. So why do we think that people with mental illness are dangerous? Well, one explanation is the availability heuristic, that when a crime occurs, a notable crime, a public crime, and I'm not in any way trivializing the crime at all. Crimes are, no matter who they occur, who perpetrates them, or who the victims are, they're terrible things. But when those sorts of crimes occur, and it's reported that the perpetrator does have a mental illness, we automatically think, because of the availability heuristic, that for some reason that mental illness is associated with dangerousness. But when you look at the cold hard stats, in fact, that's absolutely not the case. Okay, so I hope that's given you a little bit of an idea about the sorts of things that we talk about when we study psychology here at the higher education level. Psychology is a fascinating area. I mean, it is the most popular area of higher education study in Australia. More students are studying psychology than any other discipline at any one point in time. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all doing a psychology major. Some of them are just doing it as part of a separate course. But it is a very popular area, and that statistic holds true in Australia, in the United Kingdom, and the United States as well. Human behaviour, mental states, what could be more interesting? So it's an area that is very attractive to a lot of people. But do be aware, it is a science. Psychology is the scientific study of human behaviour and mental states. So it's the undergraduate psychology course is not a course in being a psychologist, in the practical skills of conducting psychology. It's a course in the science of psychology, in the course of the science of human behaviour and mental states. The practical side of it comes a bit later, and the pathway to becoming a psychologist is quite a long pathway. But the first part of that is really just learning about human behaviour and learning about human cognition and mental states from a purely scientific perspective. So what I'm going to do now, and so those sorts of topics, the things that we covered there, we pick up in a lot of different courses. There's a course called psychopathology, there's courses in cognition, there's courses in research methods, there's courses in professional practice, so and professional applications, sorry. So these are the sorts of things that we cover, that we sort of talk about, and along with a lot of many other areas to do with human behaviour and mental health. So now is I'm just going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to go to the chat box. I can see there's quite a lot of stuff here, so I'm just going to flip through. I'm going to go back to the start of the chat, and I've got a few minutes to have a look at some of the questions that people may have, and I'll just address some of the questions that people may have posed here. A lot of people saying hello to each other. That's great. Okay, so no questions yet. Just bear with me. People are talking amongst themselves. That's lovely. Nice to see. Okay. Good to see you in person, John Reece. Well, sort of. Okay, same old good. All right. Good to put a face to the name. Sorry if I disappoint you with that. Okay. Will the slides be available after the presentation? We are recording this, so I'll talk to the marketing people about this, and we'll see what we can do to get the information available to you. Okay, no questions about this. People asking some questions about the course, which is fantastic. Okay, so all right. The reason I'm just flipping through this is that a lot of people are just asking some really pertinent questions about courses here, and getting some advice from our course advisors, which is terrific. So I'm just walking through to see whether I can get some questions that are specific about the material that I covered in that presentation, because our course advisors are giving us all the information that you need for the courses here. Just to be aware though that ACAP, the second term starts on June the 15th, and we've made the decision to be completely online for all of second term. So ACAP will be a totally online college for all of term 2. A couple of people have asked about getting available of the recording and the slides. I'll definitely talk to my colleagues here and we'll make sure that we can make those available to you in some way. Okay, so here's a good question. So why are personality disorders not considered a mental illness for the purpose of assessing fitness to stand trial? That is a very, very important question and a very controversial question, because there are certainly some people who believe that personality disorders should be considered a mental illness. From a legal point of view, from a mental health point of view, it comes down to the definition of a personality disorder versus the definition of what we call an Axis 1 diagnosis, a major psychotic disorder. And that is that the idea behind a personality disorder is that people with a personality disorder don't experience the deficits that are relevant for the notion of competency. Okay, you've got to go back and look at that critical issue of competency, the capacity to be able to understand the charges against you, the capacity to be able to assist in your own defense. The idea behind a really, I mean, they're all serious mental illnesses, but a mental illness such as schizophrenia or other types of psychotic disorders is that the effect on the person's cognitive capacity is of such a nature that it calls into question their capacity to be competent and fit to stand trial. Whereas personality disorders don't have those components as part of their diagnostic criteria. So personality disorders don't have those unique elements of the psychotic disorders that are relevant towards the notion of competence. That's the argument. I'm not saying it's a straightforward one, and I'm not saying everybody agrees with that, but that's the rationale for why personality disorders. They are, as they say, disorders of the personality, okay, rather than, major psychotic illnesses. But yeah, there's it's a good one, and you'll talk about that in psychopathology. Okay. Here's a good question. So is self-medication always unhealthy, or can it be considered healthy? What an interesting question. I think that you've almost given me the idea for an essay topic there in a psychopathology course about whether that's the case. I think that the thing about self-medication is that, like anything, if people are using alcohol or other drugs, alcohol of course is a drug, if people are using alcohol or other drugs, to the point that's having an impact on their lives, on their relationships with others, on their everyday life, clearly that's not healthy. That's the definition of addiction. That's the definition of abuse of substances, where it sort of has a profound effect on your daily capacity to get on with life and so on. So if that's the case, but look, I mean, don't we all self-medicate to some degree? I mean, isn't it the case that we have a really, really rough day, we have a really tough day? What do many of us do? We pour ourselves a glass of wine. We get ourselves a beer, whatever. We might smoke a joint or do something like that. That's effectively self-medication. It's what we do. So, you know, do we feel as though it's unhealthy? I don't, when I think about myself in that context. So I think that that's a really good question to ponder about whether self-medication is unhealthy or healthy. But when we talk about self-medication in this context, we're normally thinking about it at a more serious level. So we're normally thinking about it where the person is using alcohol and other drugs to a point that is in fact having a health consequence for them and a social consequence for them. So it's normally presented in a sort of a more negative context, but good question, good question. No easy answer to that one. And as people have pointed out, it's better, if possible, to get professional assistance, to get professional help. But as we know, professional help is not always available. Professional help can be expensive. I mean, we're pretty lucky to live in Australia where we do have access to a lot of professional help for mental health conditions. But for some people, they make a choice, or they have or they may not have a choice. They may make a choice, but they may be in a set of personal circumstances where that's not such a straightforward thing for them to pursue, and so they self-medicate. Okay, and some people are having a good discussion about self-medication. That's terrific, because if you come and study with us in a course such as psychopathology, we can have a tutored class on self-medication and we can have a really good discussion about it. So interesting to see people's reactions to it. So here's a very interesting question. So if people are unfit to stand trial, will there ever be an opportunity for them to be fit to stand trial? Yes, because what might happen is that you may be found unfit to stand trial at a point in time, but then found fit to stand trial later. It's a complex relationship. And also a person's capacity does change. The critical question, however, whether unfit to stand trial, is not just about their capacity to be fit to stand trial at that time. It's also about their fitness to stand trial at the time that they committed the crime. Okay, so it's a really complex issue. See, a person might have been really, really unwell at the time they committed the crime, but then afterwards they're not fine, but they're doing okay. Okay, so, but they may have absolutely no recollection of committing the crime, zero, because when they committed the crime, they were extremely unwell. And so therefore, they may be fit to stand trial at a point in time, but in the trial, it gets established that at the time of committing the crime, they were in fact extremely unwell, extremely ill. So this is not an easy area. Okay. A lot of people talking about drugs. All right. So some people are talking more about course-related issues and things like job opportunities and all that sort of stuff. If I've got time, I will come back to those. I just want to have a look at the questions that may be a bit more related to what we discussed in the presentation today, simply because the course advisors are able to answer those questions for you much more quickly than I can right now. By the way, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask me after this, I'm very, very welcome to receive your emails. If you just want to email me at john.reece, john.reece at acap.edu.au, I'm very welcome to answer any questions that you may have. And please to be aware, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a psychologist. Okay, I've got a PhD. I'm a psychology academic. I'm actually not a registered psychologist. And that's, I think, important. So there are lots of nuances around the law that I really don't have the experience or the background to answer. Some people are asking some very complicated questions around this that I'm sorry, I just don't have the knowledge and the experience to be able to answer those questions for you. Okay. Yeah, here's an interesting question. How far away are we able from being able to test for psychopathy? We can do it right now. So there's established methods for diagnosing, evaluating and assessing what we refer to as psychopathy. Interesting question about what effect does alcohol have on mental illness, such as bipolar disorder. It varies from person to person. So that's the thing about drug and alcohol use, is that it's somewhat unknown. It depends on the person, the individual characteristics of the person. It depends on the nature of their mental health condition or their mental illness. It depends upon what drug they're using. It depends on the context in which they're using it, and it depends on the extent to which they're using it. So there's just a lot of balls that are in the air when you look at the effect of alcohol on mental illness. Okay, here's a very interesting point that somebody's made about, and it sort of relates to the historical change in how we've seen these things. And the person raises the issue of women who were diagnosed in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century with something called hysteria, and were treated for what was called hysteria. Also, the example of President Kennedy's sister, who received psychosurgery in the form of a lobotomy for acting in a particular way. The case of JFK's sister is a little bit more complex than that, but yeah, I take the point, and I think I'm really pleased that somebody's raised those points, because what it does point out is that these laws, these principles, these ideas, these actions, they're not set in stone. They change all the time. Even though the McNaughton Standard was established in the 1840s, the implementation of that, how that is acted upon, has varied and has changed and has evolved over time. So that in terms of mental health treatment, the way that we perceive mental health, the way that we diagnose mental health, the issues that we accept as being mental health and mental illness conditions has changed in the up until the first, I think, 3 or 4 editions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Homosexuality was a mental illness, was classified as a mental illness. Eating disorders have changed. Asperger's syndrome is no longer seen as a separate diagnosable condition. So it is an area that evolves. It's an area that changes as we change socially, as the research reveals more to us, as we learn more about people, and as we change as a society. Our perceptions, our understanding of mental illness and classifications of mental illness change, and what we look back in 50 years' time compared with what we see now will probably be very, very different. If those of us who are around in 50 years' time will be looking back at what we did in 2020 and say, wow, how backward were you? Haven't we grown a lot since then? In the same way that we look back at the early part of the 20th century and say exactly the same thing. So this is a really evolving area. So somebody's raised a really good point about self-medication and what we define as self-medication, and does it include things such as exercise and things such as that? In the classic definition use of the term, no, that's not how self-medication is sort of thought of. But you raise a very, very good point, and that is that there is so much research showing that exercise, outdoor activity, bushwalking, going into the bush, just doing that sort of thing, has really, really positive mental health impact for people with an illness and just for people without an illness as well. In fact, one of our academics here, Eric Breimer, has done a lot of work on that sort of area of psychology and general health and well-being. Okay. So people are asking some very, very great questions here, but they're really big questions. They're not the sort of things I can give a really quick answer to. So I don't want to trivialize them by just sort of giving you a pat answer. So I'm not just flipping over because I don't want to have the discussion. It's just that I don't really have the time or the resources to be able to do justice to some of the questions that people are raising here. So here's a question. Is somebody with acute and transient psychotic disorder and mixed personality disorder considered a psychopath? Would they be considered fit for trial? There's a few questions rolled into that. First of all, it is, you could quite feasibly have both a personality disorder and a psychotic disorder. It's not uncommon at all. And I think the use of a transient psychotic disorder, you've used an interesting term there, that it is true that some people will experience psychosis symptoms in a very transient way, sometimes drug-induced, sometimes not drug-induced, but it happens very temporarily. Would they be considered fit to stand trial? That's for the court to decide. They would have to look at all of the evidence that's available, take on board the advice of the expert witnesses, and then make a decision around that. And again, they would come basically to the point of competency. They would look at the law of competency. Is the person able to understand the charges against them? Are they able to assist in their own defence? And if the answer to that question is yes, then they would be considered fit to stand trial. And if, for example, they committed a crime whilst they were ill, they would be able to reflect upon that and give evidence related to that. Very interesting question. Would an Aboriginal person have different considerations in court regarding mental health? Complex area, and I don't pretend to be an expert in that topic. One of the things that all psychology courses in Australia are moving towards is a much stronger appreciation of cultural differences and a much stronger appreciation of Indigenous issues related to psychology in this country. So I would say that, I can actually tell you with certainty that in a course that looks at topics around mental illness and so on, that there would definitely be discussion around cross-cultural issues and Indigenous issues in specific. So I'm not an expert in that area, so I'm not going to step into it, but that will be discussed. Okay, so 2:58. So I'm going to wrap it up there, but I can see that this has really sparked some interest in a lot of people just by the nature of the questions that people are asking, and that's fantastic. As I said, if people want to discuss further with me, you're most welcome to fire me an email outside of this. I've given you my email address. And if it's sort of giving you a bit of an interest in the types of things that we discuss and that you learn about when studying psychology, then give some thought to come to study with us. ACAP is absolutely 100% open for business. We are going to be an online college for next term, but that's not a permanent change. That's a COVID-19 change. We'll be going back to we're hoping, depending on circumstances, to go back to our normal modes of delivery, combination of on-campus and online in term 3, but of course that's out of our hands. Online is a great way for people to learn. We have always had a very, very strong online presence with a big online investment. So you don't lose anything by learning in the online context. So give it some thought if you're interested in that. The ACAP website is available there. You've got the course advisors who can take your phone calls and give you advice on this. And term starts on June the 15th, second term. So if you're interested in enrolling in one of our courses, get the information, ask the questions, and make a good decision. All right, everybody. Well, look, thank you all very much for attending the session. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it informative. And if you have follow-up questions, you've got my contact details. Very welcome to answer anything that you might be willing to ask. So have a good day, everybody, and catch you soon.